In this episode, we take the account lifecycle and zoom in on one moment that quietly determines how safe the environment will be months from now: provisioning. Provisioning is the process of creating an account and assigning the access that account will start with. And it is one of those activities that feels routine until something goes wrong and everyone realizes the risk was baked in at the beginning. When you are new to cybersecurity, it can seem like provisioning is just an information technology task, like setting up email and giving someone a password. But in controls thinking, it is a governance decision that translates business intent into technical permission. Every approval step, every role assignment, and every default permission is a security statement about what the organization believes is acceptable. By the end of this discussion, you should be able to explain what safe provisioning looks like, why approvals and role fit matter, and how minimum privilege intent prevents long-term access creep. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A safe provisioning process starts with the idea that access is granted because it is needed, not because it is convenient. The most dangerous provisioning outcomes are not always obvious in the moment, because over-permissioned accounts often work perfectly and produce no immediate error that would force correction. That is why governance matters so much at the provisioning stage, because governance creates friction in the right places, forcing access decisions to be deliberate rather than automatic. Approvals are the first piece of that friction, and approvals are meant to confirm that the request is legitimate, that the requester has authority, and that the access aligns with actual job responsibilities. If approvals are weak, provisioning turns into a self-service permission factory, and the environment slowly fills with accounts that have access nobody can confidently justify later. Approvals should be understood as a chain of responsibility rather than a box to click, because the purpose is to ensure access decisions are defensible. A manager approval is meaningful because managers understand what a person is hired to do, while system owners understand what access to their system enables, and security governance understands what risk patterns are acceptable. In a mature environment, approvals reflect these different perspectives instead of pretending one person can represent all of them. This is also where beginners sometimes misunderstand speed as the main goal, because fast provisioning feels helpful, but fast provisioning with sloppy approvals simply shifts the cost into the future when access has to be untangled. The exam often rewards the idea that approvals exist to prevent accidental risk, not to slow down business, because good approvals create clarity that later reduces confusion and rework. Role fit is the next concept, and it matters because role is the bridge between a job and the permissions that job requires. A role should describe the type of work someone performs and the systems needed to perform it. And role fit is the act of matching a person to the correct role rather than building their permissions from random one-off requests. When role fit is strong, access becomes consistent and predictable, and that predictability is one of the best security outcomes you can achieve. When role fit is weak, you see messy patterns like two people with the same job title having wildly different access, or a new hire receiving access based on what the previous person happened to have rather than what the role truly requires. On the exam, questions that describe inconsistent access or confusion during reviews often trace back to weak role definition and poor role-based provisioning rather than to a single malicious act. Minimum privilege intent is the mindset that should guide every provisioning decision, because it frames access as a controlled resource rather than a default benefit. Minimum privilege means an account should begin with only the permissions necessary to accomplish its intended tasks, and it should gain additional permissions only when there is a clear business need, an approval trail, and a reason that can be defended. The word intent matters here because minimum privilege is not always perfect on day one, especially when jobs are complex. But the goal is to start small and expand deliberately rather than start wide and hope nobody notices. This approach reduces the blast radius of mistakes, because if an account is compromised, the attacker inherits only the access that was granted. It also reduces accidental damage, because people with unnecessary privileges can misconfigure systems or expose data without meaning to. A practical way to imagine minimum privilege is to think of permissions as keys rather than as features, because keys open doors that should stay closed unless access is truly necessary. If you hand someone a master key because it is simpler than issuing a set of specific keys, you have made the building less secure in exchange for convenience. The same logic applies to administrative privileges, broad file share access, and the ability to approve or create other accounts. Safe provisioning therefore treats elevated access as special and requires stronger justification, stronger approvals, and stronger monitoring. On the exam, you will often see distractor answers that grant broad access to prevent support tickets, but the better answer almost always preserves the principle of minimum privilege while providing a controlled pathway for needed access. Provisioning also has to account for the different account types you learned earlier, because safe provisioning looks different depending on what the account represents. A standard user account should be uniquely tied to a person, created through a documented request, and placed into role-based groups that match expected responsibilities. An administrative account should usually be separate from the user account, created only when the job requires it, and governed more tightly because the risk is higher. A service account must have a documented purpose and an explicit owner, because it is easy for service accounts to become invisible and overpowered. A temporary account must have an end date from the start, because temporary access that lacks expiration becomes permanent access by negligence. A shared account, if it exists at all, should be treated as an exception and provisioned with compensating oversight rather than treated as normal practice. One of the easiest ways to weaken provisioning safety is to treat group membership as a convenience rather than as a controlled mapping of role to privilege. Groups are powerful because they can grant access to multiple resources at once, which is efficient, but that efficiency becomes dangerous if groups are created casually and assigned broadly. Safe provisioning uses group membership to standardize access for a role, while limiting who can create groups, modify groups, and approve group membership changes. If you cannot explain what a group exists for and who should be in it, then the group is not a role-based tool. It is a risk container. On the exam, questions about access sprawl often hinge on uncontrolled group permissions, and the best answers tighten governance around group definitions and membership rather than trying to manually manage individual permissions forever. Another subtle provisioning risk comes from default access patterns that nobody questions, because defaults tend to persist even when the environment changes. A common example is a default that grants broad access to shared drives, internal applications, or administrative tools simply because that is how it has always been done. Over time, these defaults create a wide permission footprint where many people can access far more than they should, and then reviews become painful because removing access breaks workflows people have come to rely on. Safe provisioning challenges defaults by making them role-based and justifiable, even if that requires some initial work to understand what different roles truly need. On the exam, you may see scenarios where legacy defaults are causing risk, and the strongest solutions usually involve re-baselining access around roles rather than accepting the defaults as unavoidable. Documentation and evidence are critical in provisioning, not because paperwork is exciting, but because documentation is how an organization proves intent and accountability. A safe provisioning event should leave behind evidence of who requested the account, who approved it, what role it was assigned, and what permissions were granted at the start. This evidence becomes invaluable later during audits, access reviews, incident investigations, and even routine troubleshooting. If there is no record of why access was granted, then access becomes hard to defend and harder to remove, because nobody wants to disrupt work without certainty. On the exam, when asked what demonstrates mature provisioning, answers that include approval trails, role assignment records, and repeatable workflows usually reflect the model's emphasis on measurable governance. Provisioning also needs to be integrated with the business events that trigger it, because identity work is most reliable when it is tied to authoritative sources rather than informal messages. When a person is hired, promoted, transferred, or assigned to a project, those events should trigger provisioning changes through consistent workflows. If provisioning depends on someone remembering to email a request, the process will become inconsistent, and inconsistencies create both risk and operational frustration. Integration does not mean the process has to be complicated, but it should be predictable, with clear inputs, clear approvals, and clear outputs. On the exam, a common pattern is that identity problems arise because processes are informal, and the correct answer introduces discipline by tying identity changes to formal business triggers. It is also important to recognize that safe provisioning is not only about adding access, because a provisioning decision should include an early plan for how access will be reviewed and changed. When you grant access at the start, you are also deciding what the review rhythm should be, what monitoring will apply, and what conditions should lead to removal or reduction later. This is especially true for elevated access, where temporary administrative privilege may be safer than permanent administrative privilege, and for project-based access, where membership should expire when the project ends. Safe provisioning therefore thinks ahead, designing access to be easy to manage later rather than hard to unwind. On the exam, answers that include time-bound or review-bound access often reflect minimum privilege intent more faithfully than answers that grant permanent broad permissions. Metrics help you determine whether provisioning is safe in practice rather than safe in theory, because metrics reveal how the process behaves at scale. Useful signals include how often access is granted outside standard roles, how many accounts are created with elevated privileges, how quickly approvals occur, how frequently exceptions are requested, and how often provisioning errors are found during later reviews. These measurements are not just for reporting. They are for improvement because they help you see where the process is drifting toward convenience. When metrics show that too many accounts start with excessive privileges, it suggests role definitions may be weak or that approval standards are too permissive. On the exam, governance maturity is often reflected in the ability to measure and correct process outcomes rather than simply describing policies. To conclude, provisioning accounts safely requires a disciplined combination of approvals, role fit, and minimum privilege intent, because these three elements convert business needs into controlled access rather than uncontrolled sprawl. Approvals create responsibility for access decisions. Role fit creates consistency and predictability, and minimum privilege keeps initial access narrow so risk stays contained. When provisioning accounts for user, admin, service, shared, and temporary use cases, the same logic applies, even though the details differ. Define purpose, assign ownership, grant only what is needed, record the decision, and design the access so it can be reviewed and changed later. If you can explain provisioning this way, you are ready for exam questions that test governance reasoning, and you are also building the mindset that makes identity control sustainable in real environments.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.